All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to When Deep Calls Deep. And as we are on our journey to dwell with God, I have Will with me this morning, and we are going to talk about what is biblical theology. But first, we're going to take a second. Will, why don't you just kind of tell everybody a little bit about yourself and what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Will, obviously. I am the host of the Church Split YouTube channel and podcast. And my real goal in starting this podcast was originally just to talk about divisive issues that cause problems in churches and then how we can unite around them. But then I started realizing that there's far more issues than just a few. And I started now this is kind of springboarded into a theological channel, one that we talk about ecclesiology, theology, apologetics, the whole 9 yards. And this is what I do for a side hustle / hobby, but I'm also in my day job. I am a youth and missions pastor. And so I do a lot of that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. I love talking theology, love talking in Bible. I'm just a straight nerd. And honestly, the church was probably just a hobby that's out of control. That's probably really what it is.
Absolutely. Hey, we got a Bible nerd's got a nerd. It's one of the fun parts about this is getting to Bible nerd with people who love to do it at this depth of a level. So yeah, I thought this whole thing started as a project because I am in Old Testament biblical theology this semester. And so our first assignment was to write a definition of biblical theology. And when I signed up for the class, I was like, biblical theology, that seems kind of obvious. Isn't theology biblical? That seems kind of weird. So we're going to talk about the Old Testament, and I'm all about the Old Testament. So I'm game. Let's just go talk about the Old Testament. And so I'm trying to write a definition of biblical theology. He gave us our textbook is called Introduction to Biblical Theology, Exploring Shape, Storyline, Theme of Scripture by Jeremy Kimball and Ched Spellman, which actually I would highly recommend. That is a fantastic book. They did a really nice job of walking through what is biblical theology, and I just lost my place on there. So give me a second. All right. So, and they talk about in the beginning how hard it is to actually define biblical theology. And as I was researching, trying to write my own definition, like, yeah, actually, this is because there's so many opinions. Scholars have one definition, and scholars have a bunch of different definitions for what biblical theology is. And it's not one of the theological disciplines that has more of a popular following, I guess. So not as many people are familiar with what even it is, because I didn't know either. So I was like, okay. So, well, let's start with, I'll just go ahead and read. My definition's a little long. We're going to slog through it real quick, and then I'll let you kind of chime in and, fine tune it a little bit or kind of give me your thoughts on what your definition of biblical theology is. But we're going to jump right in here. So, okay. So
Sounds good.
My definition of biblical theology would be a centralizing theological discipline that not only biblically grounds other theological disciplines, but also provides a theological framework for telling the story of the Bible. This is done not only through solid exegetical methods, but also through historical context and study of the larger themes and arcs in individual books and testaments. It also includes historical context and information to understand the message by the original author to the original audience. This also must contain practical application from a homiletical standpoint. If the intended audience does not have an application for their daily lives, the message of Scripture is missed. So that's kind of where I'm starting for my definition. So I would love to get your take on what is biblical theology.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually largely agree with your definition, even though, yes, it's very bloated. I mean, it's a very long definition, but it's also because you have to, your definition is trying to cover a lot of ground because what happens is with a lot of biblical theology is a lot of people will be like, well, it has to be, what's the centralized framework, maybe. Like, so you, what comes to mind when I usually discuss theological or biblical frameworks are things like covenant theology, dispensationalism. Those are some frameworks that people have when they approach the text. But then it's like, well, that doesn't necessarily do you justice, because what about the cultural context? And they might have their own answers for that, but it's like, yeah, but what about like this, like the total pseudo-demographical, like, situations going on there, not just the language and how it's used, but what about even the economics and all those areas actually impact the theology, because it actually tells you a little bit how that works. Like charis, the Greek word for grace, it's an economic term, and a lot of people don't know that. And so the other thing is one of the things I appreciated when you sent me your definition, I many times is overlooked, because people go, oh, what about the framework? What about this? What about that? But you actually made a good point when that has to contain practical application from a homiletical standpoint. And I thought that was unique, because a lot of people don't actually think about the fact that, no, not only do I need to make sense of this, right, and just interpret it, but I need to make sure that there's an application to teach and preach this to encourage life change and to become more like Christ, or to be more and to draw ourselves closer to God. I thought that was actually probably the part that stuck out to me the most, was while I was reading, it's like, yep. Oh, I wouldn't have included that in there, but I'm glad you did, because it wouldn't have crossed my mind or many other people's minds. So yes, I thought that was great, and wrestling with those different things, the frameworks, but also the reason why it's important that we discuss that level of it, like even like the framework and the historical context, because there are certain people who have a biblical theology that don't think you need to include that as much. That if you do that, you're somehow underselling the Bible, like. Right. Those are people who are like, the Bible is not only our final authority for faith and practice, but it's the soul, like what we pull from it. So this is all important when it comes to biblical theology. So I think that it's actually a good working definition. I thought it was broad, but I thought it was the broadness of it is actually what made it good, because it's not overly simplistic. It is not elementary. It's because that's the problem when people try to condense a definition that's like that, it can actually pigeonhole it to an unhelpful degree.
And our professor, when he assigned it, he's like, I want your definition to be a paragraph. So it was like, it was big on purpose, because he's like, this is too big for a sentence. If you give me a sentence, I'm going to give it back to you and you have to redo it. And I was like, okay. So that gives me a lot of room to work. And as I started digging into it, because I tend to be, very into the nerdy realm. So I checked like 20 different sources, and I only sent you the ones that I cited in my
right.
not all 20 that I checked. And but he was, this guy's hard to impress, and he actually one of the few people that actually got an A on this, but it was fun. It was fun doing this because there's such a huge, broad realm. And in the book that we're using, they talk about the 5 different perspectives, or the 5 types of biblical theology that Klink and Lockett developed in their work in biblical theology. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Klink and Lockett, but I wasn't until I started reading this. But they have 5 different types. They're called BT1, which is biblical theology as historical description. So that approach to biblical theology is mostly historical. They really don't. This is the task of BT1 is to affirm the exegetical and descriptive narrative and deny the theological or normative nature of biblical theology. So we're focusing mostly on the historical context there. Then there's BT2, which is biblical theology as historical redemption. And that is historical as well, but it's undergirded with the theological presuppositions about God's prepositional involvement in history and inspiration of Scripture. So you really get into the work of God's redemption through inductive analysis of key themes, developing through both discernment and I lost my place. Through descriptive of the corporate and the whole of Scripture. So major themes like glory, kingdom, covenant, and really like the big view. And this is a big favorite in academia a lot, that one. There's BT3, which is biblical theology as worldview story. and this one I kind of thought was really interesting because the approach of this emphasis is the worldview or story view that the biblical authors operate within. So depending on the interpreter, this worldview is accessed by reconstructing the social work of the biblical or social world of the biblical authors, or conceptualizing the thought world of the biblical authors, and as they're writing this book. So this gets more into like, what were they thinking? The author was thinking to the original audience kind of area. You got BT4, which is the canonical approach, which is looking at the historical and theological dimensions of the biblical theological task through the canon. So the canon matters, the way it's put together, the descriptive theological nature of scripture, and which this one I thought was also interesting because the canon has changed so much in the last 1,000 years. So trying to interpret scripture through canon is, helpful, but also can be problematic depending on which canon you're using.
True.
And then the last one, BT5, which is biblical theology as theological construction. And this one basically throws out everything from all of the rest of it and purely looks at it from a theology point of view. So there's just the theoretical, and they're not as concerned with hermeneutical. They're definitely not as concerned with the exegetical. It's just pure theology of the Bible and not anything else to ground that anywhere. So that's kind of their 5 areas that we're kind of looking at. So where do you think, Will, that do you see in the people who don't understand biblical theology, where do you think like people would fit in the confusion of understanding like those kind of different approaches, and what does biblical theology even, like, why do we even have it?
I think, well, I mean, granted, I think it probably depends what circles you tend to circle around and orbit. I come from a very fundamentalist background. So a lot of people, I think, that I would know would probably go with something similar to the second or the canonical. And by canonical, I mean the Protestant canon. I think a lot of people I would know would go with that, and just because the redemptive model is big picture. So it's, even though, a lot of scholars go with it, and I bet you they go with it because it is so broad. I mean, if it's big picture, then you're not being pigeonholed.
Right.
I know a lot. You're like, I mean, I fit with it. You could be anywhere between N.T. Wright to John Piper and go redemptive. So then there's also, I think, the canonical one. The reason why is because I think that's where some people, at least I've interacted with, have a very extreme view of sola scriptura. So they would only pull from the canon. And what was the other part of your question? I'm sorry, I don't remember which part.
So like where these 5 things add to the confusion of what biblical theology actually is and what it does, because it's such a broad misunderstanding of what it actually addresses.
Right. And then the goal of any biblical theology should be to understand the text better, to be able to apply to your life better. It should just be a list of fun facts, but it also can't probably exist without a list of fun facts, because those fun facts lead to a conclusion, right?
Right. Yeah. So I want to kind of back up a little bit, and let's just maybe kind of go through as we're trying to tease out what is biblical theology. I think maybe just going through those one thing at a time, and just kind of like the ups and the ups and downs, or the merits and the downfalls of each approach, and how we kind of need to put pieces of all of them together ultimately at the end. But so let's just kind of back up and just start, because I kind of went through those real quick. So let's just go back and start back with, so biblical theology as historical description. So basically, the Bible is a story. It's just a description of historical events. So we're stripping the theology off of it, really, and we're just looking at it as a book telling the story of history. Is BT1. And
what I do like about it is the emphasis on the historical, because you can't. One of the biggest problems I have with a lot of people's theology is the lack of historical understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And because they lack historical understanding, they come to some weird conclusions sometimes. People know, anyone who's familiar with my work knows I harass the fundamentalists and the Calvinists a lot. Like I do a lot of chiding. And a lot of that's because I'm like, this is not what that meant. That's not what that historically meant. That's not what this historically was. And so I think that's a strength, is to understand what's the historical context, what were these people writing about, why were they writing about it, what did these terms mean. But like you said, that the weak side is that there's not an actual theological category as much as it can become. This can become a thing that a lot of like in a sense unbelievers could resort to, which is looking at the Bible and the biblical books as simply historical writings that might interest you, as opposed to something deeper. So yeah, I think that would be my issue with it the most, is the fact that it can strip away the theology and just focus on event to event.
Right. One of the things that comes to mind in this category, as I see as a downside, is the young earth, old earth argument. So you've got the young earthers who are this is the literal, this is the 7 days, this is how it works. And then you've got the old earthers who are like, well, does it literally mean this? Does it have to be 24-hour period? Like that being so focused on the mechanics of the historical hows of Genesis 1, that they're fighting about which one of those it is. And they're completely, in my opinion, missing the important theological story that's being told in Genesis 1.
Oh,
would
definitely.
be a good example of how that can kind of get us off track and get us distracted from what's important there.
Because and just so everyone is aware, I'll just kind of give a couple examples of Genesis 1, for example.
Right.
The point isn't God created specifically in these 6 24-hour days, and you have to count all the people's lifespans in Genesis, because it's really given a chronology of when this happened. Genesis 1 is written as a chiasm. Genesis 1 through 11 is kind of one big fat chiasm. But anyway, and so the center of the chiasm is the Sabbath. That God created the Sabbath. And then all these little celestial bodies and creation pieces is a polemic sort of, or a commentary against pagan views, which is saying, no, these aren't objects to be worshipped. These were created by the one to be worshipped. So anyway, it's just things that people can miss if you're not, and like, what is the point? What does he try to get at? Which I'm sure will play into the next part that we talk about.
Right. And that too, and not understanding, like in Hebrew and in Hebrew thought, the concept of time is so very different from the way that we now understand it. So it's about like cycles of completion. So each of those days is a cycle of completion. God starts it and he completes it, and then he goes to and there's cycles of completion within the cycles of completion, because days 1 and 4 are a cycle, and 5 and so it gets I get really nerdy on Genesis 1. That's really fun. It's a lot of fun Hebrew too. So
Genesis 1 through 11 is just a blast. Like it's just so much fun. Like I love going, whenever anyone's like, we're going to do a series through Genesis, I'm like, I'm there. And by the way, I apologize in advance for all the talking.
Right. Well, and one of my favorites that I love to play with there, because you don't even get out of verse, I think it's 2 or 3, and you got the tohu vavohu there, when it does formless and void. And people, like, we translate that formless and void because we have to put words on it. But that really, that tohu vavohu is wordplay on nothing and nothing. Like it's a nothing word and a nothing word. So Hebrew loves to double down on imagery with phonetic devices. So it's playing with this idea of nothingness and nothingness, but it's kind of, you see it, Isaiah goes nuts with it, with the almond tree. And the word for almond is almost exactly the same as the word for see, to observe in Hebrew. And so a lot of the interplay there with those two, it's phonetic devices and then by the time you're done reading it, you're like getting paranoid, like God's watching me everywhere. It just gets crazy because he plays with the imagery so much. But anyway, really a side tangent that was a lot of fun. But anyway, so the second one is biblical theology as a history of redemption. And this one, like I kind of I thought about this one for quite a while, because this one is the task of discerning the historical progression of God's work of redemption through inductive analysis of key themes, developing through both discrete corpora and the whole of Scripture. So that's a lot of fancy words to say we're following the major theme of redemption and restoration throughout the Bible is I think basically what they're saying there. And that one, yeah. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that one. While I kind of, my brain's kind of spinning.
Yeah. Well, I like it. Like I said earlier, what's nice about it is that it's very broad.
Mm-hmm.
As long as your theology encompasses some of history and some of redemption, you can fit it in there. And most people who hold to a biblical theology would hold to the fact that there's historical facts included in it and that God is working a restorative purpose. So it's very broad and very friendly to a lot of camps, which I think is very useful. What I think it can risk is almost being too broad. Is to the point where it might be like definitionally unhelpful. Because again, if anyone, like, a biblical theology is historically redemptive, and it's like, okay, well, everyone believes that, so everyone could claim that they hold to a biblical theology when they might not. As long as, of course, they're a believer. Again, it doesn't require much for you to believe. But what I do like about it is I'm a man who hates being pinned down into like, you have to believe this. And they're trying to put me under that little thumb. I do like it because it allows me to just kind of be like, oh, well, I technically fit within that. So I do. It's like whenever one of the reasons why I chose to work at the church I'm working at, and they hired me, was when I read their statement on what they believed. I was like, holy cow, pretty much any Christian could affirm this. Like, it's just so broad, and I like that. I like having a little bit of wiggle room. So I don't know. There's the strengths and minuses to that, but I do enjoy that aspect of it.
And well, the thing it brings to mind for me is things like when you get stuck on being obsessed with seeing covenant everywhere and everything's about covenant, or you get like one of my big pet peeves, and I get I get some people who misunderstand me when I say this, so I'm probably going to get misunderstood again because that's just me, and my brain works this way. And I grew up in it's Restoration Movement tradition, which is it's a splinter group from the Church of Christ. So that's kind of the world that I grew up in, was Church of Christ kind of world. So they're one of
that must have been interesting.
We can do a whole episode on that. That would be its own
Sure,
thing.
you could. I might have you on to talk about that. That sounds like a church splitting, interesting conversation. Anyway, yeah, keep going. I apologize for interrupting.
That's okay. One of their favorite things that they love to do, and all Christians do this, but this tradition really likes to have some fun with this. So, and I was in prophets class last semester, and we were talking about at the beginning, letting the prophets tell their own story in their own voice. And so I made a snarky remark to a real good friend of mine who was in that class with me. And I was like, oh, you mean we're not supposed to play Where's Waldo with Jesus in the Old Testament? And my prophets professor, he actually like spit out the water he was drinking. He started laughing so hard because it was like, I actually had literally heard them giving sermons where they would take a passage in the Old Testament that had nothing to do with Christology, really. And they're like, and guess what? This is what it means to Jesus. And I was like, in your Bible, maybe, but I don't see that in mine. Like it. Like, so yes, the Old Testament points to Jesus. Yes, ultimately the story of the Old Testament's about Jesus. I'm not saying Jesus is not in the Old Testament. That's
but
not
also
what I'm
you're
saying
shoving him in places that he's not in. Like, it's like whenever I've heard the Nebuchadnezzar story, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yeah. Like, whenever I heard that, it's like, and the fourth person, that was the Son of God. That was Jesus in there. I'm like, it doesn't say that. It could be.
What?
It could also be an angel, or literally a bunch of other things. So,
yeah. And I was talking to somebody from that tradition a while. It was quite a while ago. It was a couple of years ago, who was pushing back on me. It's like, I'm an Old Testament major, and they're like, well, what in the world do you want to do that for? That sounds like a big waste of time. And I'm like, well, because of what you just said right there. That's why. And
that's why I'm doing it.
like, but it's obvious, and he went to one of their favorite places to go in Isaiah chapter 53. And he was like, well, it's obvious.
Oh, yeah.
It's about Jesus. And I was like, look, I hate to break it to you, but Isaiah was not binge watching The Chosen when he wrote that chapter. So, and he got offended and left and didn't want to talk to me anymore. So I was like, it's okay. Yes, he's talking about the Messiah, but he didn't have, all the deets, and he didn't have Jesus' name and address and stuff. So
I mentioned the same thing. So I have that passage discussed a little bit in my book, because I wrote a book on the atonement. And of course, you can't talk about the atonement and the work of Christ. So I'll mention Isaiah 53 because somebody's going to bring it up. And one of the things I mentioned in there was that fact was like, well, if you read it only in that way, it makes no sense within their narrative of Isaiah, because it's one of 4 songs in Isaiah. Right. And he's clearly, it seems like the suffering servant is Israel. And in that context, and it makes sense that this could be messianic, where there's a parallel, but this is like clearly the kings, the neighboring kingdoms, as the onlooking kings, seeing how upside down justice is. They're attributing all this to God when really Israel is a shining light. There's so many. Anyway, the point is that Isaiah 53. If you one of the things that I appreciate with so many Old Testament scholars, and is that the Old Testament really does point to Christ, yes, but it's also his own thing going on there that you can pull from. Because if Israel is also the suffering servant in that context, then it also tells you that we can reflect the idea of the suffering servant, that we might serve others through our suffering. And so again, like the homiletical point you made, it can't always just be, I preach Jesus from every single one of these. It's also what's the application to the greater populace. So that's why I like your definition. But anyway, sorry, that was a whole.
Well, side tangents can be fun, but that's one example to me of where historical redemption, BT2, really gets us when you're so stuck on the theme of Jesus is everywhere. And reading things through Jesus lenses in that particular, like that case, or covenant theology, or everything's about glory, or everything's about, when you focus in on one thing, you miss the rest of the beauty of the story. So that's kind of where it goes wrong.
Oh, and actually, it's like, because I come from a fundamentalist background, and I've also attended like hardcore dispensational churches. The amount of times I've seen people try to make the smallest thing about oh, that's Jesus. That's Jesus. It actually bothers me, because I'm like actually kind of doing violence to the text. I mean, I believe that Jesus is in the Old Testament, that it points to different things. But yes, that redemptive model where you're looking for it everywhere actually becomes a problem. Because it actually, sometimes you'll miss the forest straight through the trees, and you insert it there where it's not. So and that doesn't make you less spiritual, by the way, to acknowledge that Jesus isn't in that particular part of the text. You're still spiritual. It just means that you find him elsewhere. Just go elsewhere. Right.
You're not going to collapse Christendom if you admit that the menstruation laws in Leviticus have nothing to do with Jesus. We're not going to collapse Christendom if we say that out loud. So,
exactly, 100%. Like, well, this really has something to do with like the virgin birth. Wait, what? What?
Oh my God! So, all right. BT3, the worldview story. This one, this is one of my, I like this one a lot. I don't land exclusively here, but I love this one about looking at the worldview and story view of the biblical authors, because I think there's so much that we miss when we don't, again, going back to like overlooking into things. When you have to stop and consider and listen to so like, because Ezekiel is going to be my thesis work is going to be in the book of Ezekiel, I think, because
I'll pray for you.
I love Ezekiel. And when you understand the context and all of what's happening around Ezekiel at the time, and when he's telling this story, like I when I started to understand all that, I fell in love with Ezekiel. But as you're looking at his context and you listen to Ezekiel talking about what is Ezekiel trying to tell me is important here to a group of people who have lost everything, sitting in a place that isn't their own with no identity anymore. And that just completely changes the book. when you
So Amber,
actually,
what
yeah.
is the wheel? What is the wheel? Ezekiel saw the
Okay.
wheel way up in the middle of the air, as the gospel song says. What is the wheel?
Right. So I love that question because I love that imagery in chapter 1. So as you're reading through Ezekiel, is now I've never personally had a divine vision where I've been taken out of reality into whatever cosmic realm the visions happen, but I can imagine that based on all the descriptions that I've seen, that there is stuff there that we have no human language to express. And so
Hmm.
that is Ezekiel grappling to try to explain what the heck he's looking at, because it looks like this, but it's not this, but that's the best I can do. And there's one point as he's struggling to explain this, what he's seeing in this vision, where you almost hear this 12-year-old boy come out where it's like, guys, this is awesome because I got no words for this because this is awesome, and you're just like, okay, this is going to be cool because he is so excited and overwhelmed that he's just grappling at whatever he can find to explain whatever the world that is. There's flying things and stuff. And I'm like, okay, that looks like I really want to see what that is. Someday I want to see what he was looking at because that would be amazing. Whatever it is, I don't think that, I think people overthink it. And I think it
Yeah,
also ties back to what's going on in Isaiah with the I see things imagery, because it's the same language and he's using the same Hebrew there, that God is watching. You're in exile, but God sees you. And I don't think it's any more complicated than that. I think we get crazy with overcomplicating things sometimes.
fair enough.
So
Yes.
so that's kind of what my opinion is, but I still haven't, but I get more fascinated with the rest of it, with that whole, but we don't want to get sidetracked on it. I could go on Ezekiel about all day, but we don't want to get
Mhm.
sidetracked on Ezekiel. But yeah, I think
But
really
yeah,
listening to Isaiah's context, and if you're listening to Job's context and the what's happening if Paul is in prison writing the book of Philippians, and you're like, wait, that doesn't make sense, but it's cool when you understand that he's where he is while he's writing these things. I think it's really important to listen to where they're sitting as they're telling you the story, and listening to what does Paul want me to hear in Romans 9. I don't think he's not talking about what Calvin says. He's talking about a whole different thing. He's got prophets in his head, not John Calvin. So anyway, there's our shot at that, but we'll move on from
well, I definitely wanted to mention that worldview thing because, like, around the time of this recording, a particular Christian YouTuber named Doreen Virtue has made something. She's blasted Dr. Michael Heiser. Now, whether you agree with Heiser or not is besides the point. But the point Heiser was trying to do, and whether you believe he succeeded or not, is neither here nor there, but it's to try to get that worldview. Because it is actually that when we were going through those, I was like, I really like number 3, because I think number 3, this right here, BT3, is actually really close to what I think would be if I were to put a quick label on it without like a longer definition or whatever, would be that, because that worldview conversation is so important to understand what the purpose, like when you're reading Genesis, for example, to go back to our conversation before, the creation narrative of old and new earth. Okay, well, what was the worldview of the person of he who was writing this? Moses, right? If you take the traditional authorship, if Moses wrote this, then is that really even what he's asking? Is that even the point of what he's getting at? What's his worldview as he's writing these aspects? Same with Ezekiel, same with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, all those. You have to be asking, what is that worldview and what's going on and what are they interacting with? Because one of the books I recommend to anyone who's like, well, I want to get into theology. Well, I want to understand my Bible better. What should I read? And sometimes I think they're expecting me to send them like a giant tome by like N.T. Wright or
Right.
Heiser or Keener or something. And I'm like, you need to read Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes. Like I started them off with a hermeneutics book, because I'm like, once you understand that, sometimes I come with my own baggage and I misunderstand the text because I'm a Western reader. You start going, when you start reading the text, you start going, oh, you know what? I'm going to see what other people who know better than me actually say about this stuff. What's that worldview? And as I've discovered the worldview, and like I understand like Second Temple Judaism better and the intertestamental period better, and I understand the Jewish world of the New Testament, a lot of what Jesus says starts making a lot more sense and what he's commentating on. Now, I'm not saying I'm an expert. In fact, that's actually where I plan to do my higher education is the New Testament background studies. But I want to, because I think that will help. That alone will help clarify a lot of what we got going on. So, and you doing the Old Testament, I was going, by the way, I'll have you know, my higher education, I was debating between Old Testament studies, like what you're doing, or New Testament background. So I do plan once I get my higher one, like I go through and get my New Testament background, no matter which one I did, I wanted to at least go back and try to get a master's in the other. So, because I'm fascinated by the background conversations. So.
And just for you, just because of the running joke, you picked the wrong one, but as long as you go back and fix it later, we're all good. So
fair enough. Okay.
So then this BT4, the canonical approach, this one really hits my background growing up, because they were, this is where you get into the whole argument over sola scriptura. And so I like to joke around about this, that this restoration movement tradition they go beyond sola scriptura to solo scriptura, and then they start throwing out parts of. So I actually one day, and actually I sent to you, Will, like 2 years ago, like this sermon clip, or this video of this sermon that I had sat through, and the guy at the end talked about where we need to, only as Christians, we should only focus on what he called the Christian Pentateuch, and that everything else outside of the Christian Pentateuch is just sandboxes that are a waste of our time. And he's like, he mentioned even including the letters of Paul. And I was like, wait, what? That is crazy. So the Christian Pentateuch, according to them, is the Gospels and the book of Acts, and everything else doesn't matter. It's all just sandboxes that we waste our time in. I was like, that's some fantastical heresy right there. So
yeah, it is. Wow.
Like, yeah. And I was in the room with 400 people who were nodding and yesing and amening. And I'm like, do you people not understand what he just said? Because obviously not. That's
crazy.
To
hear the words coming out of his mouth. I've been there where I'm like, it's actually it's like, that's actually the thing that I'm like, this is what gives Christians such a bad reputation. Like why people think that Christians are dumb, because that sort of thing is said. I think the canonical approach is arguably maybe the weakest out of the ones you mentioned. And the reason for that is because one, who's canon? And people could argue about the 66. Okay, great. But what about the early church where we have a list of different canons? Some of them didn't even include Revelation. Some of them did. Some of them only had a cut, like we never had the sequel to Paul's letters, right? You might have like a Timothy, but not the second. Like there's so many different ones. I think the book of Hebrews was in and out of them. It's been a while since I've looked into it, but it's like the canon widely varies depending on who you ask. And if you're going into like Ethiopian Orthodox or Ethiopian or Oriental Orthodox, I mean, you might have the book of Enoch and other ones don't. And it's just, okay. And on whose authority?
Right. And then Luther tried to get rid of James and Ezekiel because he didn't like those books. And then he took the Hebrew Bible order and broke it up and rearranged the Old Testament in a way that, if it doesn't in Jewish thought doesn't quite make sense. And when I first semester in seminary, the woman that I had for survey of historical and wisdom literature, she had us as one of our assignments was to go back and read the Old Testament in the original Hebrew Bible order. And she's like, I want you to pay attention and follow the story from that perspective and read it in that order, which it doesn't start getting too weird until after the Torah is fine. We don't do much to the Torah, and the first 5 books are in the right order. It is when you get into the books of history and some of that stuff that it starts to get really in wonky order. And it to me, I was like, wow, this is why I love the Old Testament. When I read it in the Hebrew order, it made so much more sense to me, because of the way that because that's the way that they thought about it. That's the way that they experienced it. That just there was something beautiful about restoring the original Hebrew thought behind the order of the Old Testament, that I would encourage everybody to at least once in your life read it in the order of the Hebrew Bible, because they're just different. They're just set up differently, and I can't remember off the top of my head because I haven't memorized. I have enough trouble with getting the books of the Protestant 66 in the right order from memory. I have to look every single time because I just am that way. But there's beauty in the way that those are constructed in the order. You get really funky. Esther's in a very different place. Ruth's in a very different place. Those the wisdom literature stuff is in really different order
Well,
when you
it's
look
funny
at
you
it.
said that,
So,
because I did do that. So I have some friends of mine who are Messianic Jews, and they and of course they read fluent Hebrew, and they do a lot of they keep the feasts. They do a lot of those things, and it's funny because they gifted me a few things over the years, and that was one of the things I noticed. Like if I got like a Tanakh, it was in a different order, and
yep.
and it was fun as I read it. I was like. And I noticed that too. I was like, this actually makes a little bit more sense. This has better flow. Because my daughter, I bought her. My daughter's 3. I bought her a Bible, and what I'm doing is I'm going through the Bible, highlighting things, making notes in it, and then when she's 18, I'll give it to her as like her gift from Dad. And it's really jarring to once you get past the Torah, because once you start getting like the Kings and Chronicles, and you start seeing how all these things are just. It gets weird. And I did notice that where I'm like, I feel like I read about this before, or like I'm reading about events before they happen in another, but I guess this gets weird. So yeah, I know what you mean.
Right. Yeah. When you move Chronicles to the end instead of Malachi, the whole thing makes a whole lot more sense, because you're just like, oh, there's a reason why they're wrapping that up at the end there, because now we're waiting for this someone who's coming, and now we're just waiting. And we're grappling with who is Israel and who are we and what are we doing and what the world's going on here. So yeah, it's beautiful in Hebrew order. So, which is a whole nother video. So anyway, so the last one, BT5, theological construction. This is where we throw out everything except pure theology. And we just, in our magic little brains, come up with what we think the Bible theologically is talking about without any kind of grounding at all, which I have big problems with this one. Without any kind of hermeneutical or exegetical discipline to ground you in reality, this one can really
that was. You want to talk about a broad category that's free flowing? There you go. Anything applies here. Your rules mean nothing.
Right. It's just kind of like, okay. I mean, this is the theology part of biblical theology, but I don't think any of these should be done in a vacuum. Ultimately, I think we got to kind of put them all together and use. I think there's so. At the end, when I got done, as I was grappling with this whole thing and this assignment and defining biblical theology, because I like to think in pictures. I'm a picture thinker. And so to me, I was like, as I was thinking about this and like, how would I look at this if I could create an image to explain this to me? And it popped into my head of a wagon wheel, and that biblical theology is the hub at the middle. And then you've got all the other theological and hermeneutical disciplines coming out like the spokes of the wheel. And then you've got that outer rim, which is the practical application, which is the thing that should encircle and be the rubber meets the road that makes the whole thing work in the first place. Because if your theology has no practical application, you kind of are wasting your time with a whole bunch of, head stuff to spin your brain to think about things that don't matter. Because if it doesn't reach anybody, what's the point? So that's kind of how I came to think about biblical theology, as it's that center of the wagon wheel, that the middle there, the hub, and then everything else, all those other spokes of every theology you can think of goes. The soteriology is going to go in there, Christology, ecclesiology, eschatology, all those ologies are coming out of the grounding in the middle of a combination of the 5 BTs together, holding them all together. And then that's wrapped around and contained and made practical with a homiletical application is kind of the way that I ended up landing of what is biblical theology.
Yeah, and I actually agree with. I agree with that. I think. If somebody puts a gun to my head later and starts asking me about how certain details work out, I might regret saying that. But currently, I'd agree with that, and because there's so many branches to study in theology.
Mm-hmm.
That's as a theology nerd, and you can relate, and a lot of people who listen to this would probably relate. It's really frustrating because you want to know all of it. You want to study all of it. You're just like it's a weird obsession when you get into this world. But in order to study all the different spokes, you got to at least have a good grounding. And I thought, like I said, I think one of the best points in yours was obviously there's historical and linguistic and all those aspects of understanding biblical theology. But what's the homiletical point? What is going to be preached and taught here? How does it apply to me? Because, like, honest to goodness, if you don't have any because your theology is supposed to be life changing, right? And the Bible is supposed to be life impacting. So if it's that, then I need to have a homiletical application here. I need to know what it can be. And as a pastor myself, I preach and teach a lot. So I need to know how do I make this not just a nerd out session where I just talk about things that, as a youth pastor, like the teenagers are like, eyes are glazing over and just, why is he talking about that textual variant in Romans 9? I'm so like, yeah, I can. So, or who cares about the difference between the Septuagint and the Masoretic? Like, I think that's why I think it's very important for everyone. But also, I think it's helpful for the layman, the churchgoer, who goes, "Oh, there is a point to all of that." Because once in a while, I'll hear people say, and maybe you've heard this, you guys can get into all of that, but in the end, it's all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus, and it's not all that stuff's not as important. Like, no, this stuff is the very foundation of the Jesus thing.
If you don't understand how we got to Jesus is not as cool. Like it just makes Jesus even more amazing when you understand all the background and the mechanics and all the good stuff. And you're like, yeah. So like I was laughing in our first week of this class. And the pastor at our church, one of the things I love about him is he'll bring in some of this nerdy stuff sometimes. But I think in the 8 years we've been going to that church, I can count probably on one hand the number of times he hasn't done this. But he ends every sermon with the question. He's like, all right, we come to it. Now here's the question. So what? And we're just like, thank you. And our professor said the exact same thing. He goes, at the end of the day, when you're doing your theology stuff and you're preparing whatever it is that you're doing and whatever ministry context you're using this in, you need to sit there and ask with your audience in mind, so what? And I just started laughing in class so hard because our pastor's been doing that for the last 8 years. It's so without the so what, the rest of it's just really cool, nerdy stuff,
100%.
The nerdy stuff is fun, but so what? Like, if you're gonna, you and I can go back and forth and argue about why they're wrong about PSA, but so what? What does it matter? Why does it matter? And that's the important, I think, the grounding thing that's most important about biblical theology is that so what? The Christology argument, so what? Soteriology, so what? Why does that matter?
Yeah, and that's where so PSA, penal substitutionary atonement for those who are not nerds. My book that's about to come out on that topic, available. It'll be available. It's entitled "Crushing the Great Serpent: Did God Punish Jesus?" You can order it directly from me on the channel or the website there. But anyway, that point is actually where I landed the plane toward the end. Was basically like, okay. So I just went after penal substitutionary atonement. I discussed different aspects of the language and blah, 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 and the logical issues, the philosophical issues. So I discussed some of that. Now what? So what? And the so what was you have a God who loves you and actually can freely forgive and is beckoning you. So there's this idea of there's an apologetic there. And I mentioned that our apologetic becomes stronger when we actually adopt this other view because your theological views should be able to present something very practical and helpful for people. And
Right.
I think that is a very important aspect of your biblical theology. And, not to get too nerdy there. And so that's the problem, is like we run the risk of sometimes being too nerdy, but some people run the risk of not being nerdy enough.
Right. Which I think good, solid biblical theology is a nice balance of the two. You gotta have the nerdy and you gotta have the practical, but they need each other. And so they should enrich each other. So, the Bible nerds and the non-Bible nerds have biblical theology as a should be a unifying language of look at all this cool stuff, but so what? Is I think at the end of the day, what I would say why biblical theology matters is that.
Well, also because otherwise because they absolutely do need each other. Because otherwise, what you do is you run the risk of having such bad theology that you apply various texts poorly. One of the things that for the fundamentalist world, a great example of this is one of their favorite texts to go to keep anyone from doing anything remotely fun is they will say something like abstain from the appearance of evil, right? That's what they'll say. So you're supposed to abstain from the appearance of evil. If people perceive it could be perceived as evil, you better just stop it. And of course, the Greek doesn't wash out as a perspective or perception of evil. It's literally when evil appears, like flee or run away. Right. To avoid it when evil appears. So, because what's funny about that is if you have that poor biblical theology of understanding that it means to abstain from any possible perception that someone can make from whatever position they're at, appearance of evil, what can end up happening is that you really start running into a conundrum when you start reading something like the book of Acts, where people like Paul hanging out around Mars Hill where the pagan idols are, would that not also be an appearance of evil? Well, this is why you need to understand some of the nerdy things. What was that verse trying to say in Thessalonians? And what was Paul doing? Okay, now if you understand that Paul was actually utilizing the culture and knew the culture, by the way, he was competent in the culture to be able to use it to give the gospel and point people to Jesus, then you understand the fact that that other verse in Thessalonians can't mean that, because otherwise, as a Jew, he'd be sinning.
Right.
So just things like that, where it's like, that's practical. Okay, I should be knowledgeable about my culture. I should be able to use my cultural motifs and milieu to be able to point to Jesus, but also I shouldn't be worried constantly about the perceptions of others. Like that's just one thing I deal with in the fundamentalist world a lot, but it is something that's very practical because Paul had a good biblical theology, I would argue, and he was directly involved and understood the culture. He also understood Jewish teachings, which, by the way, is a taboo in Christian circles. There's this weird you can't understand Jewish understanding because then you're denying Jesus understanding, then Christian understanding. It's like, no, they're not mutually exclusive.
Right. Jesus was a Jew, remember? Oh, yeah, we forget about that part. Oops, we were supposed to say that out loud, Will.
Sorry. Yeah, actually, that's I bet you as an Old Testament scholar and student yourself, that probably is something. Have you run into that a lot? It's almost like I don't like to use the term because it's too bloated, but it's almost like an inherent anti-Semitism that sometimes can come out when discussing that. Have you run into that?
Yes. Oh yeah. So I was involved in a conversation with somebody one day about, somebody asked me a question about why the Pharisees were freaking out so much when Jesus said Son of Man. I was like, okay, let me explain that to you and give you some context about that. And so we kind of talked a little bit about like Ezekiel and the prophets and this whole concept of as they're painting, the prophets are painting this picture of this someone that's coming to fix it is a prophet, a priest, a king, and he does things only Yahweh can do. That's the four main images that come out of the someone who's coming. And I use that language intentionally and to pull it back from let's stop doing the Jesus lenses thing and let's do the story as it's being told. So the someone who's coming. But and then when you understand the Old Testament system, wait, so you got a prophet, which anybody who is selected can be a prophet because God just goes, you're a prophet, and makes somebody a prophet. But to be a priest, you have to be a Levite of the highest caliber of Levite. And to be a king, you have to be of the tribe of Judah. Kings can't be priests and priests can't be kings. The Messiah right there is impossible. And you add in the fact that he does things that only Yahweh can do. You've got an impossible thing that is so obvious that they should not have missed it, but they missed it because it was impossible. And it's just like, okay. And when Jesus says, yep, I'm the Son of Man, they go, Ezekiel, Daniel, wait, you're saying you're Yahweh. Hang on a second. Prophet, priest, king, this is nope, we're not having this. So, and like that's why they're freaking out so much. And I was accused of not understanding Ezekiel and Daniel. And I was like, okay, so let me get my flannel board and we'll try again. And and we'll just
I'm gonna go
they
get
just
my crayons.
oh yeah.
Apparently,
They just totally missed the whole point of what I said, because they're like, nope, that's Old Testament Jewish stuff, and Jesus came and did away with all of that, so none of it matters anymore. And I was like, awesome, good luck with that, have fun.
it's such a poor understanding of theology, because I love how Dr. Gorman put it, which is like, when it comes to the new covenant, it's not that all those things are done away with. It's the fact that all the furniture remains. It's all been rearranged.
Yeah, I know.
That was
I
the
would actually,
best way to put it.
actually, it would be really fun to have you back, and you and I could have a conversation about the whole idea of, are we under the law or not? Should we be Torah compliant or should we not? That would be a whole lot of fun, because I have a really fun answer to that question, but it would be a ton of fun to kick that around, because
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd love to have that. I've had a lot of Torah observers on my channel, so I'd actually love to talk about it, because I don't observe Torah. I don't. I'm not like a. But I definitely see that why people might think that they should. So I'd love. Yeah, that'd be a great conversation to have in the future. That'd be fun.
Because I have an answer. It might surprise you, but it might not. People who know me, it doesn't surprise them at all. But people who don't understand the Old Testament context of how all that works really miss the whole point. And in my answer makes them really mad, because it involves, some of their favorite parts of the New Testament. And how dare you compare that to the Old Testament? So, it's fun.
Old Testament's been done away with. I have it under good authority that we don't have to worry about it no more. It has no application to us today.
That's right. We can unhitch from the Old Testament. I get that a lot too. Oh, we've unhitched from the Old Testament, right? And we're not. I'm like,
that's a really bad. That's like hardcore Marcionism. I like. That's actually a big issue with if your theology is constantly not like ignoring the Old Testament, you need new theology, because the Marcion heresy, is just, it needs to go away. Because like what covenant theology just emphasizes the fact that like you just recontextualize everything from the Old Testament to Jesus, like you and I were talking about. Dispensational theology just does away with the Old Testament mostly as an entire whole. And just says that was for the Jew at that particular time, and we don't need to address it. Of course, whenever I talk to dispensationalists, I'm like, yeah, but what did the law mean? What was the point of the dietary laws? What's the point of this? Well, it doesn't matter. Those things are done away with. I'm like, well, actually it does matter to a lot of people, because a lot of people, when they're searching for, like, this is where like your theology washes out practically. If people are searching for God and they come to you and they're asking you, why did God do this? Why did God do that? They're reading parts of the Old Testament that seem odd and strange and foreign to our 21st century eyes. And your answer is just, well, that's been done away with. That's not answering the why. When they're asking you why this, they're asking, can you justify the weirdness of God in this situation? That's what they're asking. And if your answer is just, don't worry about it because it's done away with, that's not actually answering their question.
Yeah.
Sorry,
you and I, it's okay. You and I definitely, I think, need to do an episode to kick that around, because that would be a lot of fun to play with. Because my answer makes a lot of people mad. So
I love that. I love I'm here for making people upset. So
I try not to. I try to agree, but as much as possible. But sometimes you got to step on toes. So
that's just the way it is. I mean, again, I'm actually, people I think I'm because the church split. It's like an intense thing. I do a lot of like intense kind of forums. But if you actually knew me, I'm actually really chill. But there's certain things, and sometimes things have to be said, and it is what it is. It's all right.
Anyway, so to just kind of wrap this all up, biblical theology. Will, why does biblical theology matter, and why should I care?
Because if you don't have a good biblical theology, you're not going to have a good application. You're not going to have proper enough understanding to make a good application, and you're going to have a poor framework on how to even interact with the world, because everything stems your entire alignment with reality and with God stems from your understanding of Him. One of the biggest lies ever told today is that you can somehow divorce your thoughts and your ideas and your views from what your behavior is. Your thoughts and your views of God directly impact your behavior, because if you truly think something and truly believe something, you will act in accordance to it. So your biblical theology matters because it actually applies from the very ground up. Like, it is the foundation of your faith and how you understand these things. Without biblical theology, without having a good framework of your biblical theology, you can have really bizarre views. And we see those bizarre views living today. And we see what's happened when we've gotten rid of good biblical theology. I hear a lot of Christians complain about progressive Christianity, but that's because of sometimes very poor, obvious understandings of things. And so if you're going to complain about a certain thing, you have to understand that stems from biblical theology. If you're like, one of the things I'll hear people say, well, I don't want to study all that stuff. I'm not gifted in that department. When I read a book, it makes me fall asleep, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, discipline yourself. You have to study this stuff, because otherwise, how are you supposed to recognize false teaching? We are warned about false teachers all the time in Scripture, but if we don't actually study, we won't be able to recognize it when it comes. So study it, get a good understanding of these things, and also don't be like gun shy of difficult topics, but also don't be trigger happy if you hear something that sounds a little bizarre to you. Take the time to understand it, and then if it's still bizarre, go ahead and attack it. But some people, they have like a knee-jerk reaction when they hear something different, and it's just take a deep breath, try to understand it. But anyway, regardless, biblical theology is important because it does impact your walk with God, and it impacts your very perceptions of reality itself.
Right. And I think, that's so important, that especially, and that's one of the things that I've been doing and starting to do on my channel, is having conversations with people that have actually gone really well. But like Tyler Fowler over at Faith Unaltered, he came on and we talked about his conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy, because I was like, I'm okay with that, but why would you do that? Like, talk to me about that experience. What drove you to Eastern Orthodoxy? Why? So that was a great conversation. I learned a lot about Eastern Orthodoxy and about how that resonated with him. Fantastic. And then I had Tattered Bible Project or podcast, Jacob Seiler on. I don't understand oneness Pentecostalism. What in the world is that? So come on and let's just talk about it. Because I saw in a collab that he did with Warren McGrew over on Idol Killer, and a bunch of people, when Warren's like, hey, go check out his channel. And so a bunch of people went over and subbed his channel. And then 3 seconds later, figure out he was oneness Pentecostal, and they all unsubbed and came back and like, what's the deal? Why do you have this guy on here? Why are you talking to this guy? And I was like, I don't even understand that reaction. So you know what? I contacted Jacob and brought him on and like explain oneness Pentecostalism to me. And I'm very much still a Trinitarian, but I understand it a lot better now. And so now I can have conversations with him in a more intelligent way because I understand it, and I'm not so quick to label him as a heretic. I'm starting to get very annoyed with that word that is so overused and abused. And
it absolutely is. That's why I mean, there's a joke. I mean, I'm prone to say, what's up, heretics, on the channel and joke around that everyone's a heretic because of how abused it is. So I like to abuse it more. But no, I helped to lead a Jehovah's Witness just left to Jehovah's Witnesses. And we had like a 6-hour conversation about Jesus being God, and he eventually believed that Jesus was incarnate. And the whole thing was like, but I took the time to really study what Jehovah's Witnesses believed, because I want to know what to talk about and what to talk to. And if I'm not willing to sit down and have that conversation with somebody about how they come biblically using the Bible, whether you think they're abusing it or not, but they're using the Bible to get to their conclusions, then if I'm not willing to do that, then what am I even doing? And the thing is like I love hearing people talk about like, well, it's so obvious. Like, actually, it's not so obvious that Jesus is God to someone who has been taught to read it a certain way. Like, we look at Lord, Kyrios, as being, oh, well, that's obvious. He's Lord. God is Lord. He's Lord. And it's like, well, Lord is just an authority figure. It can be Lord is a broad term. So that actually doesn't get you. So a lot of people pull verses that say he's Lord, thinking that they're somehow proving someone who denies the divinity of Jesus wrong. And it's like, well, you have to show why Lord in that sense means God. So there's a lot of misunderstandings of that conversation. And I am very much a Trinitarian. I very much believe in the divinity of Jesus. In fact, I argue that the incarnation is ultimately what saves mankind. But I'm very much with Athanasius on that because he's
Right.
based. But
But I
like,
haven't gotten to Athanasius in class yet, but by the time I do, I'll be back and say, Will, you're probably wrong about that. But
that's your motif. Like, I
that's
expect
my
to hear
motif.
Amber to tell me I'm wrong. Like, if Amber tells me I'm right on something, then I know I'm really in deep waters. I finally nailed. Maybe that's what I know. I'll finally have arrived. Like when she's like, he's right. I'm like, yes.
Yeah, I actually had to admit that Pritchett was right yesterday. It was killing me too. I was like,
twice. He was right
twice.
twice.
I know. Oh, it's killing me. I was
Unbelievable.
like, oh, dang, twice he was right. I know. That was fun. We have too much fun. All right. So
Yes.
we're just going to go ahead and wrap up. So this is probably
Yeah.
going to be coming out here in a few days. So for first, I'm going to give you a chance, like plug your book. I can't wait. I ordered it. I can't wait for it to get here and send you an email about everything you got wrong in your book.
Looking forward to it.
Like, but yeah, give us a thing about your book and then tell us kind of what's happening on Church Split, what's coming up. What are we going to get to see out of you coming up soon here?
Absolutely. Well, I'm really pumped about my book. And the main reason why I wrote this book, and I've been telling people this because I just want to make sure I set proper expectations while also and giving it the proper sales pitch that it is. It is a direct challenge to penal substitutionary atonement as often it is articulated. And what it is a popular level book to do that while also sourcing people like Heiser, Jacob Milgram, and others, where Grenstead, Davis, and a bunch of others like who are known scholars in that field. And what I wanted to do was my biggest frustration when penal substitutionary atonement fell apart for me was I felt like I had no home to go to. Like I had to keep reading these other books and pulling from that source and this source. This is kind of start feeling like I had a more well-rounded view, and especially Old Testament theology, because it was really difficult to find an accessible approach to Old Testament sacrifices and trying to understand that at a different light. So what I did is I got so irritated about it, and I had so many people blow me up on Twitter for about 6 months. I'd get dozens of notifications a day about how I'm an evil heretic and denying Christ and go into hell because I deny penal substitution. That it put enough fire in my belly to write a book about it. And so I wrote a book to be an accessible, popular level book that's supposed to give you the overview of this. And I do focus a good amount of time on the Day of the Atonement ritual and how people are actually really focused on that as far as the sacrifice of Christ is concerned, when it's really the Passover. That's the focus. Hence why it's Pesha that Jesus is doing this whole thing. And there's a lot more imagery I could go into, but the point is to give a popular level book where you put it in someone's hands and it gives them the starting place to start their journey against penal substitution, or they can accept the answers that they are. But there's much deeper things. I had to delete chapters. I had to add some things. I even kept some things in there. I was kind of like, is that too much? I don't know, but it is what it is. I just had to try. But anyway, that's what the book is. I'm looking forward to it, to hearing all about how wrong I am. And and I'm actually on it. I've honestly thought about creating like a more detailed second edition, like you know how Heiser started with the Unseen Realm and then really Supernatural, which was like his like condensed version. Well, on my condensed version, I thought about doing my bigger version. We'll see what happens. I don't know. But otherwise, the Church Split, we're going to continue on what we're doing right now. We're doing a lot of responses to defending Michael Heiser against a bunch of slanderous attacks, and there's really no other way for me to put it besides slander. And I wish I didn't have to say that, but it's lies and slander. It's not just I disagree with him and here's my reasons why. It's just inserting words in his mouth that he never said. It's really gross. I hate it. And then also I'm doing my regular theology stuff. I'll be having a video out here soon on original sin, Augustinian original sin, and kind of redoing something I did a long time ago, but with a hopefully better production value. So that's what I got going on. And so if you like that sort of thing, subscribe. If you don't, subscribe anyway. That doesn't cost you anything. Jeez.
Right. Well, you know, like I think you're in the same camp with Warren over there at Idol Killer. Like half his subscribers are hate follows that subscribe him because they hate what he says.
I'm okay with it. I'm over here like if someone's like yelling at me in the comments, I'm like, thanks for helping the algorithm, good sir.
That's right.
So far, people be like, you should quit. You should be on here. I'm like, well, now that you commented, you're helping me stay on here. So I hope you realize you're playing yourself.
Thank you for feeding the beast that you hate so much.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. Man. That's
Yeah, that's
amazing.
great.
So yeah, we've got on my channel here, we've got some things coming out. I did an interview with the guy who was been a family friend forever, who is a Bible translator in
That's
Africa. And
cool.
so we talked about, how does Bible translation work? What are they doing? Like, how do you become a Bible translator? And then we spent some time talking about, can I trust my English Bible, and which version should I choose, or which version should I avoid? So that's coming out here pretty soon.
Oh,
And
that
I've
sounds like something
got,
I want to listen to. That
yeah,
sounds
that's
great.
that's going to be fun. That one's going to have a part 2, because we had so much fun with that, and there was so much we had to leave out. So I think we're going to go back and do a part 2 to that one. And I'm working on some things with some collabs. We're going to talk about what do we do with an emotional God? So God has emotions, and what do we do with that, especially the negative emotions? So what do we do with an angry God and a jealous God, God with full of wrath? So that's going to be coming out here next month. I've got a conversation with somebody about the history of the Restoration movement. So we're just going to kind of let them present their case and talk about how they got where they are. So we're gonna that'll be interesting. And I've got uh, Seventh Day Adventists coming on to talk about Seventh Day Adventism, and we're going to talk about Sabbath also on a whole separate. So there's 2 collabs on that with that one. And I'm going to be coming out with, in the end of October, later October, a conversation about shame in Genesis and how that's portrayed in the prophets, and what do we do with the history of shame that we have inherited from Genesis. So starting in Genesis 3. So that'll
I like
be
that.
yeah. So that'll be interesting. Those are going to be some of the fun collabs. And we're also working on a collab about, how do men and women talk to each other in deep theological discussions, because there seems to be some confusion about how we do that as well. So got all kinds of things to put myself in the line of fire with some stuff. But I think just cracking open some of these conversations and finding the positive, the good things and the things that we all have in common, because I think a lot of us have a lot more in common than we realize, that when we focus on so much of the negative, that we're talking past each other, and we agree more than we think we do. So
I agree with that. Yeah.
that's really what I'm focusing on with some of the stuff I've got coming out. So and then, of course, always talking about how the Old Testament matters and why the Old Testament matters. And I'm going to be doing a series on time in the Old Testament and how that changes the way we read some of the Old Testament, and understanding some of that and some of those things. So lots of good stuff coming up on here. And so, but thank you so much, Will. I really appreciate
absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I had a blast anyway. I had a good time talking about this. Anytime I get to theology nerd with people who like the theology nerd,
who get it.
That's right. So many people are like, and a lot of people don't get my fascination with the Old Testament, but that's okay, because they're missing all the fun and they're wrong.
Oh, I do. I love it. Old Testament's fantastic. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I eat it up. It's so good. And I love scholars and people like you who are doing that work, because we need more of it. And yeah, absolutely. And I'll probably be joining your ranks eventually. We'll see what happens.
Well, late to the party is better than never, I guess. Which is
fair.
I give Nick Quinta such a hard time all the time, which is how I got in trouble and started getting the reputation of telling people they were wrong all the time. Was because
but Nick's always wrong. It's fine.
Well, I started giving him a hard time because he picked the wrong testament. And so that's where, I think that's what finally caught Pritchett's attention, because I was like, oh yeah, the New Testament's for wimps. Pick a real part of the Bible. And so we just kind of started snarking back and forth about that. So
that's amazing.
I got myself in trouble there. So it was fun.
That's fantastic.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Will. We had a great time, and definitely we will have to do some more collabs going forward in the future, talking about some really fun Old Testament stuff. Maybe, team up and look at
I'll have to have you.
things.
Yeah, I'll have to have you on. Maybe we could talk about something. We'll figure it out. DM me and we'll figure out a thing. I'd love to have you on my channel.
Oh, you mean the one who actually responds to DMs gets to DM first, and then
hush. Like, we don't talk about my response rate. I have a 3-year-old and a lot going on, and I swear I respond in my brain, and I'm like, 2 days later, I don't think I hit send, or I don't think I actually responded to them. It's bad. I'll be honest. Here's what's annoying is I honestly need to just get a manager eventually, because the problem is like I have too many social media platforms and too many DMs, and then I get distracted. So I'm sorry.
Right. I know. I'm
That's-
just giving you crap.
It's not you. It's me. I am very well aware of my problems, and my wife will agree. So you'll be like, "Yeah, that sounds like him."
All right, everybody. This has been a lot of fun. Hopefully you have as much fun listening to this as we had doing this together. And as always, we are looking to journey to dwell with God on a deeper level every day. And so go and be blessed, and take the message of the gospel with you everywhere you go.
Let's roll. Yeah, that's great.